Romany and Raq by G Bramwell Evens. Give me the clear blue sky over my head and the green turf beneath my feet, a winding road before me, and then to thinking. Chapter 13. Kestrel Ledge, June. At this time of the year I always know where to find John Fell, the gamekeeper. He is watching his young pheasants in the field, where numerous coops hold his silkies. These are an excellent type of broody hen used as foster mothers. Leaving Raq outside the enclosed land, I walked over to his hut, where he was busy mixing food for his big family. "And how are your young pheasants coming on?" I asked. "Fine," he said. "The dry weather suits them better than the wet." "Had many losses?" I asked. "A few," he answered. "The crows are very hungry for 'em, and you've got to keep your eyes skinned for any hawks that take a fancy to young game." "Pampered darlings," I said, referring to the artificial protection meted out to these fancied youngsters. "Aye," he said, shaking his head, "and we pay too big a price for the preservation of these and a few others." I knew what he meant, though naturally he spoke about such things with reserve. He loved every wild thing. As he was silent, I put into words his own thoughts. Just because a comparatively small number of the community want the pleasure of shooting game, every enemy of it has to be exterminated. Stoats, weasels, polecats, hawks of all kinds, buzzards and kites, harriers, ravens and owls, all have to go. As he came out of the hut, a wood pigeon flew up into one of the trees at the edge of the field. "Have you ever noticed how numerous they are becoming?" he said. I nodded. "So numerous that shoots are now being organised in many districts to thin down their numbers." "That's so," said John. "I'm always telling you, you can't upset the balance of nature. You kill the hawks and the cushat escapes. The sportsmen get their pheasants and the farmers are overrun by pigeons. An unnatural raising of one breed means an unnatural killing of another. And between the two, some of the oughtn't gets the benefit." "By the way," I said, "I hear that you had a kestrel's nest that you were keeping to show me. Have you time to go today?" John consulted his watch. "I'll give these coops a drop or two of water, and then Ben the underkeeper should be here. If you'd like to have a ratch round for an hour by yourself, I'll be ready for you." Raq looked rather reproachfully at me as I released him, but the wag of his tail showed that his forgiveness was a very complete one. "We're on our own for a short time, old man," I said to him. "Let's take it easily and potter round just to see what we can find. Shall we go down to the river?" Now, whether he understood all I said is questionable. He loved the tone in which I spoke, and knew that its omens were good. Also, he knew what the sound river meant. Whenever I spoke it, there followed a visit to the running water which he loved. So when I mentioned it again, his whole body wriggled with delight, carried unanimously, wagged his tail. Along its banks veiled with trees and swaying grasses, we proceeded slowly. I almost put my foot upon a little whitethroat's nest. From under my boot a midget bird with a light throat and a grey-brown back fluttered onto a neighbouring spray of meadowsweet, which curved as though it would break under its dainty burden. Then, in a little nest, screened by the mosses of the bank, I saw 6 small white eggs with scarlet spots dappling them. I retreated from the feathery home but a few yards, and the little mother, in no wise afraid, fluttered back onto a blackberry trailer, peeped at her nest to see that all was secure, and then popped in to continue her incubating. As the dog scrambled along, I saw a different bird leave the bank, and as soon as she reached the shingle, she immediately began to do the broken wing trip. Raq, of course, saw her, as she meant him to do, and was lured far from the nest she had left in the bank. There I found her 4 light brown eggs with their rich dark brown markings. When the dog returned from his vain chase, we hid ourselves, but no bird returned to the nest. Here were 2 nests within a few yards of each other, but what different temperaments the owners possessed. How differently, too, the nests were built. One, the sandpiper's, rested in a scrape on the bank, and was lined with bents and dried grasses, a very ordinary affair. Peggy Whitethroat's was a tender little home of moss, hair and feathers, cosily tucked under the grass thatch at the top of the bank. For a short time a heavy shower began to fall. Lovely music the big drops made on the outspread leaves. Only a few moments before the leaves were green with a matte surface. Now each one glistened like a mirror, and as the sun shone through the cloud, the leaves reflected the blue sky, shimmering green and blue on each leaf. And behind in the shadows stood the dark trunk with soft tones of grey, purple, green and black. What a glorious world! As the rain fell in great drops, the gnats still kept up their endless dance. How in the world do they manage to fly in the rain? One drop, if it struck them, is enough to dash them to the wet earth. One drop is enough to bedraggle those wings of gossamer lace, and yet this tiny wisp of dancing life defies the shower. I wonder, yes, I wonder, whether the big drop in its rush to the ground creates such a draught that it wafts the little midge out of its track. I am still wondering. I wish I could be certain. When we returned to the field of the young pheasants, John was ready to accompany us. Is it far? I asked. 3 mile, maybe, up on the fell, he answered. That means nearly 5 miles, I said, turning to the dog. We've had some of John's arithmetic before, haven't we, old man? John smiled, and I said, Did you say that there were young hawks in the nest we're going to? The keeper nodded. And are you going to destroy them eventually? I asked, knowing that many keepers complain of the kestrel's damage to young game birds. No, said John decisively. The only time I shoot a kestrel is when I find him deliberately visiting the young chicks and making off with 'em. As a rule, you'll find that a bird which raids coops has a nest full of young uns not so very far away. That's the time you've got to stop a wild freebooter like that. He was silent for a moment or two, and we plodded quietly along our upward climb. I'm sorry for 'em too, for they're only doing what all on us does. Getting our living along the line of least resistance, eh? Finding our food with the least amount of fag, I explained. That's it now, said my companion. Good morning, Dave, said he, as an old shepherd who was following his sheep up on the hillside. What's the weather going to turn out? The old man rested on his stick, whistled shrilly to his dog to lie down, and surveyed the sky as slowly and thoroughly as though he were looking at it for the first time in his life. I don't like the look of it, said he, and, after learning whither we were going, said, Well, don't go along Thorsfell Ridge. There's mist coming, and you might be up there at night. Shall I offer him a bit of tobacco? I whispered to John. Not on your life, said he to me, with a note of fear crept into his voice. He calls them the instruments of the devil, and we'll never get to their nest if once you make him loose on pipes and such like. Now our walking became more difficult. A stiff climb would take us up to the top of a ridge, only to discover that between us and the next height lay a deep gill. In this all was peace and quietness. The wild pansies smiled at us with their yellow open faces, though the little blue speedwell closed themselves for security, as though emphasizing the shepherd's warning. Amongst the rocks a grey, white and black bird, with a dark stripe running from the bill through the eye, curtsied and flitted with jerky flight from stone to stone. I looked at my companion. Wait here, said he. That yellow-tinted breast goes well with the grey, don't it? Dap a little, gentleman, he added, as we watched it dart in and out of several hiding places. Shall we find his nest in one of those holes in the stones? I asked, eager to find the bird's domicile. John shook his head. He's fooling you, said he. He'll dart into a score of places, but you'll be a lucky un if you come across it easily. We plodded on. Must be a great change from Africa's sun to a wild place like this, he added, alluding to the annual migration of this bird. Then, as we neared our final climb, John touched my arm and pointed upwards. At first I could not see anything. At last, hundreds of feet up, I saw a dark speck. Kestrel, said John. I brought my field glasses to bear on it, and for a moment or two the hawk, head to the wind, seemed to be suspended motionless in mid-air. A faraway cry full of solitude and solicitude trailed down to us. Keely! Then a pause. Keely! Lonesome it sounded, yet it caught the very spirit of the crag and glen. She's watching us now that we're getting near the nest, said John. Near the nest, are we? I repeated, wiping the perspiration from my brow. We're glad to hear of it, aren't we, old man? I said, turning to the dog. And in order to hearten me, my companion pointed to a shoulder of rocks about a quarter of a mile ahead. It's yonder, he said. As I looked up at the ledge where the young ones lay, the whitewash on its rim and down the face of the rock advertised their presence. The youngsters were shouting out for food. I found a foothold which enabled me to reach up into the nest with one hand, but I hastily withdrew it. I had been used to handling young birds with impunity. These young hawks resented my intrusion, and promptly fastened their claws into my fingers. Shaking hands we are, they, laughed John from below, as he saw the quick withdrawal and surprised look on my face. I drew myself up still further, and then I saw those I had climbed far to see. They're about 1,600 feet up, said John, as I gazed at 6 little fluffy furies who were ever ready to turn on their backs and bring their yellow talons into a fighting attitude. As the keeper saw me watching them, he said, They're ready for giving you straight left, I reckon. I nodded. And they are handy with their grey curved beaks too, I said, sucking one of my fingers. Then, before I got my camera to work, I examined their eyrie. A flat ledge of rock was the nesting site. There was only the scantiest of nesting material, and the odour was not that of Araby. Brown feathers from the breast of some small bird told of their menu. I threw some down to John, and he said, Titlark. Then I picked out a skull which still possessed a blunt, rounded nose of fur. Fieldvole, I heard John say, as he examined it. I fixed the camera in position and carried away with me something of the fierceness of the rounded liquid eyes, full of flame, glinty flame. A hard life lay before them, but no fear or yellow streak lurked in those bold orbs. Very soon, too, instead of that silken down, would be chestnut-tinted wings that would learn how to swoop on prey shivering in the grass, or to poise a slender body motionless in a breezy sky. Young thrushes in the nest call forth my sympathy. The feathery wisps of life in the tit's hole touch some tender chord within. But the young hawks thrill me with a sense of adventure, and send me forth to face the world with a more dauntless courage. The secret lies in their eyes. Not far from the hawk's nest, a bird, not unlike a blackbird, flew near us with some concern. Ringoozle, said John. See the white crescent on its breast? It squawks like a starling, I said. And pipes like an angel when it's a mind to, said he. A clear ringing flute, speaking of joy and content. He bent down and called me to look at a hole in a broken down wall. There lay 4 little embryo songsters in a nest not unlike the blackbird's. Why, I said, that kestrel can see them when she's on her own ledge. Why doesn't she use them up for her hungry young? That's one of the mysteries, said John. Things that live handy to 'em they seem to leave alone. Live and let live may be their motto for their near neighbours. And so we set our faces homewards. The rain lashed us with fury, and the wind tried to stem our descent. But what odds? Had I not seen the raiders in their lair, and perchance caught something of their indomitable courage? Many times, too, shall I, when hemmed in by streets and house fronts, let my inner eye look upwards towards the blue, and see in imagination the mother kestrel, now circling, now motionless, in the larger air. Even the vision of that will tend to lift me out of the routine shackles of every day, and for a few moments I shall hear the gee of the wider sky.